Thanks, everyone. And thank you to CSIS for holding this very timely and fascinating conference, bringing together so many vital perspectives, both from the region and from here in Washington. I'm very honored to moderate this panel with Dr. Ahmed Driss, who's the president and director of the Center for Mediterranean and International Studies, and Mr. Arezki Daoud, who edits the North Africa Journal. We'll be talking about government approaches to countering terrorism in the region. And to frame the discussion, I'm also interested in drawing out my fellow panelists on the sort of impact, pitfalls, considerations inherent in US strategies toward countering terrorism in this very complicated arena. I'm interested in their perspectives on what has worked, what hasn't, what needs to be taken into account in the future. As you all know, the US approach to countering terrorism in North Africa involves multiple lines of effort. In Libya, obviously, it includes direct military action. In the other countries of the Maghreb, we see a security assistance and cooperation approach aimed at building the capacity of partner forces, partner militaries, which includes extensive military sales and grants in some countries, training and other types of support with varying levels of engagement depending on which country we're talking about. We also see the US obviously engaging in sanctions programs and terrorist watch lists to limit terrorist financing and mobility, as in other regions of the world, as well as programs designed to counter violent extremist ideology, or CVE programs, which have been particularly prominent with regard to US partnering with Morocco, but we also see similar efforts in the other countries in the region. Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia participate in a long-running State Department-led regional counterterrorism assistance program in North and West Africa, known as the Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Partnership. But TSCTP has largely focused over time on the poorer countries of the Sahel region, and much of the US security assistance relationship with Maghreb countries runs through bilateral channels. The State Department has historically led these kinds of efforts, but over the last 15, 16 years, we see an increasing role for the Department of Defense as Congress and the executive branch have worked in some ways together to increase the scope and level of resources and authorities available for DoD activities in this space. And that may have, implications, political implications for our own government as well as for the region. As we saw in the aftermath of the recent deadly attack on US soldiers in Niger, the expansion of these kinds of programs is not without risk and raises policy concerns and considerations both for US and regional actors. From where I sit in the US Congress, and the Congressional Research Service where I work is a legislative branch support agency, there continues to be a debate within our government over the appropriate legal and policy framework for US counterterrorism in regions of the world affected by threats that may be primarily local and regional in scope, but which have the capacity to affect US interests and personnel. And I look forward, as I mentioned, to exploring perspectives from the region and on the region with my esteemed panelists. More broadly, I'm interested in discussing sort of some of the unintended consequences that may be possible, or some of the considerations that may not be front and center, but perhaps should be. With that, I will turn it over. We didn't discuss order, but actually perhaps to Dr. Driss first, and then Mr. Daoud. Thank you.
Well, good morning. First of all, thank you very much to the Center for Strategic and International Studies for the invitation, and in particular to Haim for having me here. When I saw the program and the order, I felt myself uncomfortable because I have to speak under Admiral Akrut, who is the responsible of the security, who is Mr. Security and Mr. Intelligence today in Tunisia. So I also have to deal with that and be careful on what I am also saying. But so speaking about the the Tunisian strategy, or Tunisian strategies in plural, to counter terrorism, to counter radicalization, I think three key words have to be underlined. The first one is reforming. The second one is restructuring. And the third one is vision building or vision making, which is also innovating now in Tunisia. On the first point, reforming. Reforming what? You know, after the uprising, Tunisia have a new constitution, and the new constitution was adopted in 2014. And since that, everything should be in accordance to the constitution. So that means that also our legislation have to be amended, reformed, transformed, in order to be not in contradiction with the new constitution. The new constitution indicates in two disposals, one on the military, the other one on the security forces, that both of them are Republican. So which means that maybe in the past were not Republican, or serving other things than the Republic and other things than the people. So which means that now all efforts made by the security forces and by the military have to only be driven by that concerns, serving the people. And in accordance to that, the law, or the new law against terrorism and the repression of money laundering, was adopted in August 2015. And this law, the new one, replaced the former one adopted in 2003, immediately after the 9/11 attack. And the title of this, the former law, was Law on the Support of the International Effort to Combat Terrorism. So support of international effort to combat terrorism, as if the terrorism is outside of the countries, only international, and Tunisia have to support only the effort to combat it internationally. So now we have this new law, which is more precise to define not terrorism, because all the time we have a problem to define terrorism. And our legislator also faced the same problem, and he's not able to define the word terrorism or the concept terrorism. So we have a list of acts considered as terrorist acts, and this can be used to define what is terrorism. So terrorism is linked to those acts defined in the very long list, but it is precise and clearly underlined in this law. The law is also more respectful of the rule of law, which is very important because, as Admiral Akrut said this morning, one of the objectives also in this strategy is to be very respectful to the rule of law. And I will explain later why, because we have also to create ownership by people, and if we are not in accordance to the rule of law, people will not consider as serving them. A new element in this law, which is very, very important, I think, is a chapter on special investigations means or tools. And this was not at all present in the former law. So the new law precised the role of the structure and how to investigate in order to, and this is very, very new and also very respectful to the rule of law, because everything had to be allowed or with the permission of the judiciary. So, which is also very important. And the last new point in this law is the creation of the National Commission for the Fight Against Terrorism. So now there is this commission to also analyze, to make research, etc., and to also adopt strategy to fight against terrorism. So this is reforming the legislative framework. The second idea is about restructuring. Restructuring what? Restructuring the services. And it is, now we have a very, we can qualify it as a complete and very detailed frame or services frame. It started since 2014, immediately after the election of the current president, so which seems that all the effort to restructure the services is also linked to that, and also the presence of Admiral Akrut behind the president. Restructuring the services, it started in November 2014 by establishing a new body, a new administrative public body, which is which gave the autonomy to this body. Because before 2014, it was the General Directorate to Military Security as part of the Defense Ministry, and this General Directorate was responsible of intelligence, military intelligence within the Defense Ministry. But since 2014, it's replacing the former Directorate of Military Intelligence by a new body called Agency for Defense Intelligence and Security, but still related only to defense services, not to cover all the intelligence services, but only to protect agent equipment and secrets of the Department of National Defense only. But it's a new body, and it's a new autonomous body because it's a public administrative body. And also, this agency had to contribute to the prevention and fight against terrorism. In 2016, a decree established a Center for Military Research, which is also very new. So now there is the vision, autonomy of the new body, autonomous, and then the Center for Military Research to conduct research in military areas related to national defense policy. So another step to restructure the services. And the last one, in January 2017, by the creation, the National Intelligence Center. So the National Intelligence Center is considered as a new step in restructuring the services because something really new. In the past, there was only the defense intelligence that was created, but now we have the National Intelligence Center, which is the main purposes of that center is the coordination between the various national intelligence organs. And with this indication in Article 2 of the decree that this is the role of the National Intelligence Center, it answers to a consensus because since the uprising in Tunisia suffered a lot from the miscoordination between the services. This was the main obstacle to fight, of course, terrorism, but also and mainly to face any of the threats that Tunisia was facing since 2011. Absence of coordination or difficult, very, very difficult coordination, and this was one of the main demand during the 3-4 years to establish a body in order to coordinate between the services, and this was established since January this year, 2017. And also, the other objective is the development of the National Intelligence Plan. So that also means that there is a new vision in order to have a plan and to monitor the execution of that plan, which is also a new element. And no, before that we have the, yeah, it's supposed to have a PowerPoint presentation, but I am using for myself only. And also in January 2017, the same day, 19th of January 2017, there's the reformulation about the National Security Council. So National Security Council, as this morning it was indicated that Admiral Akrut is now assuring the permanent secretary of it. So let's say that this council was established in 1990 by the former president, and I don't see any difference between the objective of this National Security Council in 90 or today. The same Article 1, it's the same. The National Security Council should ensure the safeguarding of vital interests of the state within the framework of a strategic vision aimed at the preservation of the sovereignty of the state, its independence, and to guarantee its integrity, the integrity of its territory, the security of people, and the protection of natural resources. It's Article 1 of the decree of 1990. So it's the same purposes or the same objectives for what the National Security Council was established. But what is new now in this decree, that this council is also responsible of the national strategy to fight against radicalism and terrorism. So, and to update periodically this strategy in coordination with the National Commission for the Fight Against Terrorism created by the law of 2015. So the link with the new law is established there, and also the link with the Commission to establish the national strategy against terrorism. So this body, the National Security Council, have to work in this way today. That's it. And also the presence of the new director of the new body created, the Center of Intelligence created, has to replace the director of the Defense Agency in the composition of this National Council. But which is new today is a decision taken by the President by the 13th of October, last October 2017, creating 15 ad hoc commission within this council. One of them is also intelligence, under the presidency of the Admiral. But the Admiral is present in the other also 15 commission, as he is the permanent secretary of the council, so he has to be present everywhere. But also both the Minister of Defense and Interior have to be present also everywhere, or at least one of them in the 15 commission. But what is curious, that that the 15 commission cover all the domain of the executive, not only intelligence, defense, interior affairs, etc., but also education, health, energy, under the nomination of security education, security energy, security. So everything is related to each of the domain of the executive plus security, which is also creating a lot of trouble now in Tunisia. Is this council replacing the government in somewhere? But this question has to be also we have it's legitimate to answer to this question, because one of the maybe risk is the dysfunctions of the institutions, since we have the duplication of the, so we have each minister is responsible of a committee, and each minister is behind himself. There is the Minister of Defense or Minister of Interior, plus the Secretary General of the National Council, the Security Council, and okay. So what the head of the government will do with that, and this can create a sort of dysfunctions, and it creates a risk of dysfunction between the institution. So we can discuss it later. Yes, 1 minute. In the last minute, about the strategies, let's say, and here I am quoting Admiral Akrut in one of the declaration he made in December 2016. So the objective of the of this strategies is prevention, protection, prosecution, and responsiveness. I am right. So yeah, prevention, protection, prosecution, responsible. I can say that for the three last, protection, prosecution, and responsiveness, the strategy can be perfect. Because of the frame, of the legislative frame, because also the operational capacities empowered now in Tunisia since the last three years. So Tunisia is more able to respond now than before to the threats. But one remain problematic for me is the prevention, because prevention need transversal strategies, and we are only building a vertical strategy. And this is problematic. Why? Because we are not able to take all the aspects linked to radicalization and to answer them as a threat, or answer them as related to terrorism and counterterrorism, and for example, corruption. So corruption, it's not one element of the national strategy because it's only vertical and it's not transversal. So if we transform it as a transversal strategies, then we can include the fight against corruption and to coordinate more with those who are fighting against corruption now, mainly the head of the government. Yeah, so this and the last thing is about vision or about innovating. And I think that between November and early this year, November 2016 and early this year, it was announced by the Minister of Defense the launch of the White Book. The White Book is an innovation in Tunisia, and it was explained that it's an innovation because modern armies use this technique to think about the strategies, to think about how to build armies in a new ways. So now it's also time to have in Tunisia a White Book, and I think that it was launched in November 2016. There is several goals, but I have no time to explain or to speak about the all goals of this White Book. But let's say that this is a very important element now to understand the vision in Tunisia first. But, and again, I have a remark here. The White Book is supposed only to create ownership. Ownership between the structures, between the, of course, military and security structures and people. We have to create confidence between people and those structures, because without peoples you cannot fight terrorism. Because terrorism is not coming from abroad. Terrorism is there on the ground and living in our cities, and people are there. And the new generation of, like Musbah, the fast food generation of jihadis, in 2 weeks you have a jihadi, because you have to face not only jihadi but also Salafi, and the word was not used this morning, Salafi, and we have a lot of Salafis in our country. And in one moment, those Salafis will cross the border between being non-violent and being violent. And we have to be prepared to that. In order to be prepared, we have to involve all the component of the societies. And we have to work on one thing, which is now problematic. This thing is how to deal with our religious behavior and with our religious discourse. We have to learn how to not use the concept of haram, halal in our in the society. Haram, halal, what is permitted, what is forbidden religiously, and we are in our houses using it all the day. This is haram, this is halal, this is haram, this is halal. So also we can be considered as part of the Salamist movement, because tomorrow we are creating those who will defending the haram or the halal. So be careful on that. And we have to involve society on that. And we have to make the societies learning how, in the pedagogic, pedagogy way to avoid that. This is also part of the innovation, and we have to deal with that, and not only to speak about ourselves and to be between experts or between those who are in the civil society but close to us. No, we have to speak to all together and to involve them all together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and we'll move to Mr. Daoud.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, CSIS, for inviting me. So I have been tasked or asked to discuss the not so easy topic of counter-terror strategies for Morocco and Algeria, and I will do my best. Right from the start, it's very clear that the two countries share many similarities that include population, cultural, and religious profiles. That includes also a level of economic development, and to a certain extent, deeply centralized governance that we see sometimes could be a root cause of some of the problems that we see develop in the region. The two countries obviously have different attributes and characteristics when it comes to deploying or deploying counter-terror strategies. For example, Algeria does require a broader contribution of all the security services, whether they are the gendarmerie, the military, the border patrol affiliated to the Ministry of Defense, or the police affiliated to the Ministry of the Interior. And that's because, considering certainly the vast size of the country and the risk zones along the Tunisia, Libya, Mali, and Niger borders. In contrast, Morocco has been relying heavily on a centralized FBI-like agencies called Bureau Central des Investigations Judiciaires, which I will refer to from now on as the Bureau. So as we get close to the end of the year, how did the region do in 2017, and what do we expect to see going forward? Let me start with a quick status check for the year that's closing first. It's clear, looking at the research that we do, so this is not government data, this is private data. Our parent company being Mayor Risk, and we continuously track what's going on in the region, that 2017 could be considered by the Moroccans and the Algerian authorities surprisingly as actually a stabilizing year. This is not a stable year, but clearly a stabilizing year, and we'll share with you some of the numbers. Being directly exposed to the crises in Mali, Libya, and Niger, Algeria is closing the year with much bigger numbers in terms of incidences and counter-terror operations. But in general, when you take sort of the broad Maghreb region as a whole, minus Libya, due to its complex set of circumstances, the number of terror-related incidents, those are terror-related incidents, again surprisingly, fell by nearly 45% compared to 2016. So we're talking about numbers up to pretty much today. And if you compare them versus 2016, the numbers of critical incidents dropped by 45%. For the three Francophone countries of Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia, our parent company, Mayor Risk, recorded 65 terror-related incidents this year, down from 118. So these actually hard facts. The trend is indeed remarkable, considering that Morocco, for instance, did not record one single incident. So what you have left is essentially you divide them by Algeria and Tunisia, and that's roughly the type of number of incidents that we've seen. One of the reasons that led to this drop in militant action can be attributed to both the de-radicalization efforts undertaken by Algeria and Morocco, and the work that's being done on the enforcement side to prevent and interdict terror attacks. The ability of security services to adjust has clearly led the actual law enforcement units and even the military on the ground to actually work a little less than in the previous couple of years when we've seen peaks in 2015 and 16. In fact, the number of security operations in the three Maghreb countries dropped by 56%, so it's a pretty big drop as well, to settle at less than 1,400 known major security intervention and sweeps. So this is what the militaries and the security agencies have been doing. But clearly, that doesn't mean that security services are taking a back seat. They've been extremely busy with the number of arrests that we've recorded reaching over 5,200. So a little over 5,000 people have been picked up as part of the various sweeps that we've been tracking. That was still a 17% decrease from 2016, but if you compare it to the previous year, 2015, there's been a ramp up. It's a 34% increase compared to 2015, which was a very busy year. So this is not necessarily good news because this figure that I shared with you, over 5,000, extends to the arrest of civil society stakeholders, in addition to suspected terrorists and criminal elements as well. So let me focus a couple minutes on Morocco, then I'll move to Algeria. So how does Morocco counter the rise of extremism and terrorism? We've heard a lot of it today. It clearly uses a multidimensional approach that involves adjusting its legal tools, reforming the religious environment, closely tracking and monitoring existing and emerging militant groups. There's been a severe crackdown on networks of militant recruitment and financing. And obviously, there's been enhanced security cooperation particularly with Europe, but around the world as well. In an effort to control the narrative of clerics and preachers and to remove the extremist elements from mosques, Morocco created at least a couple of institutions specialized in teaching and educating imams. And sermons are tightly controlled with the topics directed by religious scholars employed by the government. Any deviation from the allowed speech would cause the imam a great deal of hardship. The terror attacks against Casablanca in 2003 have been a major starting point for Morocco in terms of creating and adjusting its counter-terror strategy. Several years later, authorities even released some of the Salafis that were arrested in the aftermath of 2003 attacks, some of whom have pledged allegiance to the king in the country and are now playing a very strong role or a key role in securing mosques against extremist elements. On the enforcement and intelligence fronts, the Bureau has been instrumental in monitoring and neutralizing all sorts of networks and arresting suspects. The Bureau has a lot of resources and is part of a domestic intelligence agency called DST, which I think is the equivalent of Homeland Security here. And it collaborates with the investigating branch of the National Police. We've heard some numbers today. I think from 2002 to 2016, Morocco says it dismantled about 170 suspected terrorist cells. They also report that over 3,000 suspects, exactly 3,145 suspects have been arrested. We hear numbers from Morocco that says 344 planned attacks have been stopped as well. And obviously, the Moroccans are keeping a very close eye on their nationals who left or leaving the country, in particular those who end up in conflict zones. For instance, estimates from the Bureau say, and we've heard those numbers earlier, 1,600 Moroccan nationals went to fight in Iraq, Syria, and Libya, mostly with Daesh, but also with Ansar Sharia, Al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra, and other organizations. One of the biggest challenges, again, this is a theme that we've heard earlier this morning, is sort of the role of the social networks playing in terms of recruitment and financing and funding. Data from Morocco suggests that 80% of active Moroccan IS fighters have been recruited through social networks. They mentioned Twitter, Facebook, other social media sites. In May 2017, the authorities have removed almost 400 Facebook and Twitter accounts, and a move that has accelerated since then, but official clearly also acknowledge that there are individuals and groups who use encrypted networks and the so-called darknet, and therefore are very, very hard to monitor. So this is a phenomenon that they're facing there. For its part, Algeria's war against insurgencies did not start in 2003. I grew up in Algeria in the late 1980s, and the proliferation of religious-leaning dissent was absolutely substantial. Even the most liberal, the pro-Western individuals were often attracted by the religious anti-government narrative that authorities tolerated after the independence in the 60s. The mosques being the only tolerated centers of political meetings and discourse, the clash between them, that is the mosque and the government, became inevitable and obviously almost permanent. It was in the early to mid-2006 that the government drafted a reconciliation process to allow the more moderate elements of militant Islam to distance themselves from the more radical ones, and to distance themselves against also the ones that are considered irredeemable. The Reconciliation Charter included controversial clemency options and reinsertion into society, a process that's still, by the way, practiced for those willing to surrender today. There was also an economic incentives with jobs and allowing the candidates to own their own businesses. Just like Morocco, Algeria also tightened the control of mosques, starting with a centralized process of training preachers and the inclusion of women in providing religious guidance to the community. One outcome of the change has been the banning of the political discourse in mosques and the exclusive focus on theology and religion. The education system there, currently spearheaded by a female minister, also underwent transformation at the curriculum level, but clearly introducing moderate views in the country's school system has been a major challenge and continues to see extreme resistance from the conservative movement. It's a very conservative society, and there's a lot of people that are resisting any changes in the syllabus and other educational instruments. Obviously, some of this strategy has paid off. Unlike neighboring Tunisia, for instance, which has some 2,400 nationals fighting with Daesh in the Mid-East, Algeria reports about 200 nationals who left for combat in the Middle East and elsewhere. The Algerian figure is apparently far less than those of France, Britain, Belgium, and other Western countries individually. So part of the strategy appears to be working. On the enforcement front, how are the Algerians executing on their counter-terror campaign? Firstly, just like Morocco, the Algerian militant risk is largely homegrown. There are rarely foreign nationals captured by the Algerian security services to speak of a global jihad movement in general. It's mostly a domestic phenomenon, and it's spearheaded by the likes of organizations called Jund al-Khalifa and Qaeda in the Maghreb and others with a domestic focus, although they themselves are offshoots of these global jihadi movements. The Algerian and Moroccan authorities have had zero tolerance policy towards support networks, which they often treat as if they were the actual militants themselves. Both target support and recruitment networks with an aggressive stance, with those networks comprising of both sympathizers of the jihadi cause, but also civilian populations that are caught in the process and have been forced by local militants to provide support or risk retaliation. And that's particularly the case in rural and isolated areas. The second category should be considered as extremely vulnerable and treated accordingly, given that they are sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place. Given its lengthy borders, Algeria also appears more vulnerable to weapons trafficking and smuggling. The military has been active in discovering arms caches along the borders with Mali, Niger, Tunisia, and Libya, in addition to the ones in the northern provinces. The phenomenon of contraband and human trafficking also tend to feed into the militant networks by providing resources, mostly benefiting Al-Qaeda and the Maghreb, as we've seen before. These activities mean that the Algerian military and paramilitary troops have been extremely busy and possibly stretched to their limit, specifically the need to ensure border security with Libya while securing oil facilities as well as urban centers and rural areas, require substantial resources and a massive share of the state budget. Manpower certainly remains a concern, and therefore Algeria has been pursuing a modernization of its military capabilities with the acquisition of weapon systems that the military leadership deems adequate to fight the current level of insurgency. In both countries, most of the insurgent groups appear to be small-scale cells, as we've heard before, that are inspired by a central organization that is more ideological in its purpose and a lot less as a provider of resources. This may be a reason why we have not seen major attacks. However, their proliferation makes it very hard for authorities to catch them all. Unlike the attacks we saw in the West, the region does not boast similar lone wolf types. The attackers in the West also target the host population as well. They are different in terms of religion, culture, etc., and so there is a different impact. The vast majority of support takes place within Algeria and Morocco proper, but Algeria is also confronted with an influx of militant resources from both Tunisian and Libyan borders, has the military focus on border control as well. These support groups outside of its borders are obviously tied to the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, considering that these organizations have a regional mandate as opposed to a localized mandate, but operationally, local militant groups tend to have a greater degree of autonomy. So in conclusion, the problem is that while it is necessary for these countries to pursue an aggressive anti-terror campaign, there are several shortcomings and concerns that could fuel tension in the future, and some of them were mentioned earlier. For instance, the socioeconomic demands of the populations in both countries are often met with the use of repression instead of normal channels of conflicts of resolution. The unrest in Al Hoceima, Morocco, and the ongoing labor, social, and economic protests across Algeria are a basic example of populations that are strained and have not seen an effective response from their political leaders. A continuation of such tensions, in the absence of a comprehensive political and economic strategies, militant groups will absolutely continue to tap into public anger for recruitment purposes. So the year ahead looks also challenging. Not only Algeria, Morocco, and indeed the entire region will struggle economically, but there has not been a substantial political progress in the region to advance stability. The Libyan crisis continues to poison security in the region. Mali and indeed the Sahel remain highly destabilized. Tunisia remains politically fragile and economically fragile. The end of the Syrian crisis has been debated earlier and also adds another wild card in terms of the security going forward with the return of thousands, potentially thousands of fighters. Facing these uncertain issues as escalating austerity measures and poorly managed economies that are fueling discontent and further threatening stability. So in closing, we do expect to see 2018 as a continuation of this year and could be slightly more challenging as we contemplate the return of some of the jihadis into the region. And with that, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you very much. It's a lot of things on the table that you both have raised. As I mentioned in my introductory remarks, the United States, but also Europe, European powers, and other external actors continue to seek viable partners in this region to pursue shared security objectives. That kind of approach may be the best of many possible options, some of which would be more destabilizing perhaps or have greater negative implications for domestic politics in some of the Western countries. But those kinds of approaches are contingent on having sustainable partners who share both a similar perception of the threat and prioritization of actions, but also who share sort of ground rules about appropriate tactics and mechanisms for countering some of these groups. I wonder if you could both touch on the ways that Algeria and Tunisia in particular, as border countries to Libya, have approached this partnership question with regard to Libya, because Libya is certainly a country where the level of chaos and political disunity have proved serious stumbling blocks to U.S. efforts to seek viable, sustainable partners for counterterrorism. So I'm interested in sort of how Tunisia and Algeria have approached the Libya situation over time, how those approaches have changed maybe since the initial Libyan uprising in 2011, how Tunisia's approach might have changed under successive governments. And then I'm interested also in drawing you both out a little bit on how external actors' priorities may have shaped the counterterrorism approach of countries in the region. And you can sort of select which countries to talk about if you'd like. And then we'll turn to Q&A, although we have relatively little time, so please be brief.
I can give you my point of view on sort of where broadly Algeria and Tunisia stand, or at least what's the impact of Libya. I mean, obviously Libya is not only a wild card; it's a wild place. There were hopes that a better political process in the north would stabilize the country. There were several attempts to bring the various feuding parties together. It really didn't work. It still is a country that's causing an enormous amount of tension in the region. The jihadis, the Islamic State that were at some point in Benghazi, then Tripoli, went south. They're penetrating into Niger. They're going into Algeria, and so an enormous amount of resources that countries like Tunisia and Algeria are spending is really to make sure that these infiltrations are limited to as much as possible. Very hard to achieve when you have massive borders, but still it's an effort that's ongoing. What's the long term, what's going to happen longer term remains a big question. I think as I stated in my conclusion, I think we're going to continue to see what we've seen in the past year or 2, 3 years continue happening in Libya, and therefore the border areas will remain a major issue. Now, Algeria and Tunisia might have different approaches to security. Algeria has been insisting on having an internal Libyan conflict resolution process. It's a political process that involves mostly Libyans, so it's a Libyan solution. Obviously, the presence of Western troops in Libya is cause of alarm for the Algerian military and the Algerians in general. I think Tunisia has taken a little more advantage of that by having the Americans, for instance, helping with drone surveillance and border control. So each of them has different take. But it's very dangerous to limit the discussion with these two countries alone. I mean, there's obviously Egypt on the other side. There's the issue of the Sahel. There is obviously migration issues to Europe. It's a very, very hard conflict. And when it started, I think we predicted that it'll take at least 20 years to sort out. And I still stick with that number. I think it's going to take a long, long time for Libya to get its act together. In the meanwhile, a great deal of the budgets, the budgets that the neighboring countries are going to put aside for military it's going to increase over time, and that's going to create a lot of tension short of a political solution on the short term.
Well, yeah. With Algeria is all the time the same issue. They're all the time saying that we are brother. But don't forget that we are the big brother. And of course, this can be a sort of useful link with Algeria, because we are profiting of their experience, and the coordination with them is very important for Tunisia. So on the side of our borders with Algeria, the cooperation is perfect. But since Algeria is against interference or against any role of international actor in the region, then I agree with Mr. Dawood that the approach is very different. And Tunisia, as a small player, cannot play alone. So Tunisia need to be present and have to say something on the field. But at the same time, Tunisia needs to be supported by international actors. And this is not really acceptable by the Algerians. But anyway, for the, on the Libyan case, for example, Tunisia tried to have its own position. But in the same time, Tunisia is in a very difficult position because with whom can Tunisia discuss in Libya? Those who are in our borders, there is a real ideological conflict, let's say, between those who are in power in the western part of Libya and the current actors, political actors in power in Tunisia. So this is a very fragile situation, and Tunisia have to have the support of Algeria, because without Algeria we can now go further, but in the same time to balance with also the need to have support from international players or actors. And this, on this plan, Tunisia have a lot of partnerships with international actors. They have a partnership with Europe, in particular. Tunisia is part of the so-called European security and defense policy, because Tunisia is not part, but also considered as one of the most important countries in the region, since with Morocco, both are partners with Europe. Tunisia is taking part of the 5+5 defense dialogue. It's a non-formal dialogue, but it's also different, important, because Minister of Defense meet and discuss, even informally, but it is very important for Tunisia. Tunisia have bilateral relations, very strong relations with France. With France, we have even a defense agreement, but it is very old defense agreement, and we don't know even it's still on the table or not. And of course, the last years was a very important partnership with also US. But the problem now in Tunisia is that, of course, we are in consensus democracy, like Mikhail said. But at least we have several political actors present and free to comment and to have their own views on the relations between Tunisia and other international actors. And it is very difficult today to take the responsibility and to say we are partner with that. We have the support of US, and we endorse this support of US. And this is very problematic because how to face the society when you have the courage to say that, yes, we have the support of US, we have the support of France. All the time we are trying to dissolve the reality in a sort of political correct discourse. And this is, yeah.
That's very interesting. All right, we'll move to audience Q&A. And I think maybe we'll take 2 questions, given the short time. Looking for people who haven't already asked questions, but since we just have 2 hands, we'll go Bill and then Hamid.
Another excellent panel. Congratulations to CSIS for putting this together today. It seems to me most of the discussion, or perhaps the most interesting part of the discussion in this panel, was about vision. And I would argue that for all of the discussions we need to have about vision and all the vision building we need to do, Algeria and Tunisia have huge capacity issues. If you compare Algeria and Tunisia to the Moroccan case, I got the sense, and knowing the Moroccan case, that they're a little bit ahead on the vision aspect, and they're considerably ahead on the capacity, the ability to change policy and then implement those policies. If you study Tunisia closely, there are huge capacity issues stemming from the revolution. And Algeria has a different problem, sort of hollowed out ministries from the 90s, and forced early retirements and security. So you have this sort of weird bell-shaped curve and missing competences in Algeria too. So my question to both panelists is about capacity. You can have a great vision, you can work out a great vision, but if you can't implement that with the leadership that's required and the tools that's required, you'll always come up wanting.
Sorry. We'll just ask one more and then we'll combine answers.
Mohamed Melouche with the Tunisian American Young Professionals. Very related question, in fact, to what Bill was talking about. But there's this perception, or at least maybe it's a reality, that radical movements are always one step ahead, in terms of their use of technology, in terms of, there's been a lot of discussion around use of social media, of encrypted networks, of encrypted emails. And my question is very much related in the sense that, are we prepared in Tunisia, in Algeria, in Morocco to face the threats that are coming our way, in terms of cyber security, in terms of digital currencies, money flows, tracing all these, and what kind of support we need from our friends in the U.S., the European Union, to face those things. And then, very brief question to my friend Dr. Driss from Tunisia, related to the National Security Council, which he sort of portrayed as a very integrated structure which is needed in Tunisia, but that may perhaps pose a problem in terms of roles and responsibility of the president versus the head of government. President is elected in Tunisia, has specific roles per the constitution. Head of government is appointed by the assembly, but after a proposition of the president. Do you feel like the Tunisian democratic model is sort of structured the right way?
All right, perhaps you'd like to lead us off.
I think to the first question, I agree with you. I mean, there's certainly a perception, perhaps, of capacity issues, but if you look at the three countries that we're talking about, I mean, geographically, they're vastly different. When you talk about the challenges facing the central country of Algeria in this case, the borders are extremely lengthy, and the bordering countries are all crisis countries. Algeria being itself a crisis country as well. Whereas if you look at Morocco, clearly its northwest presence or location, with a couple of borders, one heavily militarized on the Algerian Moroccan side and on the Mauritanian side as well, suggests that the types of issues that they're facing have to be different. In the case of Morocco, a lot of it is homegrown. When you talk about the presence of militant groups, a lot of it is homegrown. A lot of it is driven by some of the issues that were talked about earlier, economic, social, political issues. In the case of Algeria, it's that plus the issue of controlling the borders as well. So I do agree with you that there's, when you look at these countries, you get some discussion around capacity, but capacities are driven by the realities on the ground. I mean, you look Tunisia specifically, it's proximity to Libya. That's the primary cause number one. But we know of all the social issues that the Tunisians are facing in rural areas, in border towns, in cities where basically employment or unemployment is a big problem. The rule of law is a big problem. The abuses that some of the kids have been facing there are key contributors. And these social factors are, you could argue that they're common denominators in the entire region and probably beyond. So certainly you do have common factors, and you have factors that are specific to each region, and I would argue that border control is probably one of the biggest as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, as you said, vision building is very important, but how about capacities? I think this morning we were at a discussion with Ayn Moizan, the capacity of absorption of our, in Tunisia, for example. And it is sure that it depends on international support, and the international actors are hesitating, supporting Tunisia in accordance to their capacity of absorption. So I think that Tunisia is able to absorb any support Tunisia can have. And the problem why the actors are hesitating, I think it also depends on not the capacity of absorption of the Tunisian government, but its capacity to convince the international actors that they are able to also to play in the correct way. And this is problematic because also it is due to the political system that we have. So there's another impact of the political system. Of course, Mr. Malouche asked whether the Tunisian model of democracy is it the right one? So we can imagine that those who designed the current political system designed it in order to have more balanced power but looking for balanced power can also lead to the absence of the total absence of responsibility. And when you have to face absence of responsibility, you have no actors that you can deal with, because all of them are absorbed by other concerns than to serve the national interest. And when the national interest is not clear, is absent, maybe international actors cannot be confident on what you are doing, and then they cannot support you. So we have to convince our politicians that they have to be careful on that and to work together in order to serve the national interest. But anyway, the system is now 2 years and a half after the adoption of the constitution. So we have no clear idea whether the system is delivering what it's supposed to deliver. But let me say that in a partnership with the Tunisian Institute for Strategic Studies related to the presidency, we will work together on a sort of diagnosing the system in order to see where there is the dysfunctions in the system here, and also in order to be able to advance not solutions but vision for the future.
I'd like to, if you don't mind, I'd like to address actually one of the questions the gentleman asked earlier about technology and controlling all of that. And I think it's a slippery slope in terms of trying to control all of this. It's legitimate for governments to try to do something about it, but legislating, controlling, and repressing is, in my mind, not the right move. And clearly, we've seen some disastrous example. I think this past last school season, I think Algeria has blocked the internet for a week because there were leaks in the baccalaureate exam, and I would argue that's not the right way to do it. There's absolutely there is a right argument to say we have to control all these inputs into the Salafi movement and the jihadi movement. That makes sense. But the approach that is kind of being proposed by many, with governments under pressure to implement such drastic measures, not the right way to go. In terms of international cooperation, I think I was asked the same question about 10 years ago. Is the U.S. in a better position than Western Europe to support what's going on in the region? And the answer is a little more nuanced than that. It's first of all, it's actually a domestic issue. So really, you have to be able to bring as much support to the local governments and the militaries in terms of knowledge and counter-terrorist strategies, etc. But it's a fight that the locals have to fight first and foremost. And secondly, obviously, there are some elements that could be outside of their pay grade in terms of border controls, technology controls, that would require the skill sets and the technologies of like the US or Western Europe. But in general, I'm an advocate of it's your internal issues, you gotta fix it, you gotta fix the politics of it. You have to work with the local with regional governments, Tunisia and Algeria are doing a pretty good job. I mean, some of their militaries are able to cross the borders to help each other, and that works well. With Morocco, you know, there's this never-ending Western Sahara crisis that caused big hardships for the region. But I think it's a domestic issue, providing capacity for the local governments, making sure that also they abide by the rule of law, that there is a parallel political and social process that enhances that don't push the people towards radicalism, but also providing the necessary support in terms of technology, in terms of ensuring that you know, the banking system is not helping those movements to go from bad to worse.
All right, I will bend the rules to take a last question. Of course, sir, please.
Thank you, ma'am. I want to add something about, since we are talking about the Tunisian model of National Security Council, the decree of 1990 maybe have talked about sûreté nationale, not national security, and the level was more operative than the right. The actual is more political and strategic level. Second, the Article 77 from the new Constitution of 2014 have specified the composition of the heads of this council, and we have Tunisian specificity. We have the president of the Senate inside with the executive. So there is no real worry to see shift in power with this council. This council have the old one has 7 permanent commissions. The actual one, 15 permanent commissions, because the level already changing. The mission and the tasks of the National Security Council from the Constitution were more wide, so we needed these 15, not a shadow government, but these 15 commissions were working to talk about threats, maybe opportunities, and to give a report to the National Security Council, which had the Prime Minister, the President of the government, and the 2 other presidents. So there is no way that we think that and that and that. First. Second, related to our national strategy, counterterrorism and extremism strategy, I had the honor to work on this, and we had as a team with us from the United Nations Directorate, Counterterrorism Directorate. They show us the way to install and to prepare a national strategy, and as I told you, we managed to have this 4 basement with the human rights and so on. With the National Security Council architecture, we tried to learn from the experiences of others, and we had many table round with the Europeans, British, French, from Belgium and other countries, even from Serbia, and we learned from them without transposing their system to Tunisia, but we learned too much from them to advance and to not make the same error that they made. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the important insider clarifications on Tunisia's NSC. Thank you. And please, all of you, join me in thanking my fellow members of the panel.
Ladies and gentlemen.